Hi, everybody. Richard Deej Webb here. I'm hooking in a bit early just to make sure that we don't have any technical issues. I'll start at 5 o'clock. And obviously, I'll do this again, but thank you for joining. Since we have a little time, and if you've come in a bit early, I'm at Old Mill Beach in Westport, Connecticut. And I'm looking out over the sound that Scott and Zelda swam in. So it's really fun. And we have a few minutes. So settle in, grab a beverage. Hi, everybody, again. I started a bit early just to make sure that there's no technical snafus. You know how that works. And we'll be starting in about 3 minutes. So thanks again for joining us. Stand by for a live feed. One gets a lot of practice these days doing things like these. Zoom has been fun. Skype, of course, and something I just learned about, House Party. I recommend it. Don't ask me how it works yet. I kind of mistakenly have figured out how it works. Again, for those of you who have joined us early, I started a bit early. We will start officially at 5 o'clock. Just wanted to make sure again that all the technology is working, and I think it is. One minute to count down. Turned into winter in the last 5 minutes. Pretty New England. One minute to go. Okay, hi everybody. My name is Richard Deej Webb. Thanks for joining me today. Number one, hope you didn't have anything better to do. And I want to thank the Westport Museum for History and Culture for inviting me to do this author talk. And the way it's going to work is it's going to be about a half an hour. If we run over a bit, I guess that's, good news. There'll be time for questions, and hopefully I can answer them to the best of my ability. It's 5 o'clock, which I think is kind of neat. It's cocktail hour for many people, and I think Scott and Zelda would have approved of that. So hopefully they're in the room with us, at least in spirit. So what I'm going to be doing is describing my book, Boats Against the Current, and it's good timing for me personally. The second edition has just come out on Amazon. It's the Centennial Edition because it is exactly 100 years since the Fitzgeralds were here in Westport, Connecticut. And there's been some updated information that is very interesting. And it is reflective of the 2 years of research I've done since the first edition came out. I'll be doing readings from it. I'll try to make those as brief as possible. I'm a retired educator. I taught high school and college for 25 years. And the first thing that can put a student to sleep is reading to them. It's almost like a bedtime story. And so I'll try to limit that, but I do want to give you a flavor of the book. And again, we're going to be leaving some time for some Q&A. All right. Let me give you a brief bio as it applies to the book and the research. Grew up in Westport since 1967, and I started pursuing the Fitzgerald story in Westport when I was 14 years old. I grew up a quarter of a mile away from the Fitzgerald house where they honeymooned for 5 months in the summer of 1920. By the way, they never owned any property. They had a very peripatetic existence, and their average stay over their lifetimes was actually 5 months, wherever they were, depending. So I used to ride my bike around there, and at 14, I started to read his second novel, The Beautiful and Damned. And I then read that it was written in Westport, and for most of it at least, and that half of the book takes place in Westport, the characters, the scenery, the geography. Now, this is before the internet. And again, back to my bike, as I was reading the book, all of a sudden I was struck by the fact that I was reading a road map of Westport. South Compo Road, Longshore, East Ferry Lane. These places are discussed in the book because they have importance to Fitzgerald. And I was stunned. I mean, I've never read a book before where you could literally follow the characters today. And by the way, what we do is I lead Gatsby tours on behalf of the Westport Historical Society. And it's a 2-hour tour. I take people through scenes that happen in The Beautiful and Damned, which feature Westport, and as we'll talk about, of course, The Great Gatsby. So if you're interested in that, go to the Westport Museum of History and Culture website, and you can sign up. Our first one's scheduled for May 23rd. We do about 8 of them into the fall. Right now, we're shooting to do that. We'll obviously see in these extraordinary times. So when I grew up and I had more access to research, I did read that The Beautiful and Damned was about Westport. And again, as I rode around my neighborhood, I began to kind of dimly think, was The Great Gatsby influenced by Westport? And, I was kind of thought, well, this part might have been or that part might have been, but it didn't really gel in my mind until in 1996, a family friend of ours gave us a New Yorker article called Westport Wildlife. By the way, you can get it online. You have to pay for it in the New Yorker. But it was written by an extraordinary authoress named Barbara Probst Solomon. She just passed away. And what I'm very happy about is that we were able to bring her story into the book. And we've also got a documentary out called Gatsby in Connecticut. It's going to be in 3 festivals in 2020 and probably more. We're just waiting to hear back. So what was great is we were able to interview Barbara, get to know her really well, and bring her story to light because her story was suppressed. Her story and her theory about the Great Gatsby in Westport was suppressed. A certain academic, and we write about him in the book, did not like her theory that Westport was the Great Gatsby. They claimed it was Long Island, Great Neck, which it is. Really what the Great Gatsby is, it's a beachy blend of Great Neck, Long Island, and Westport, Connecticut. So very happy to discuss Great Neck in the book, and rightfully so. And she laid out in this article, and there's excerpts of it in my book, and a synopsis of it, but you could read it for yourself. Again, Westport Wildlife, New Yorker Magazine, 1996. I think it was in September, but don't quote me on that. So I put this all together, and by the time I was 16, I'd read his first 3 novels, including, of course, Gatsby, and I decided, after 42 years of kind of pursuing this story off and on, what I did was I presented at local historical societies, at schools, at colleges, PowerPoint, the whole idea of Gatsby being about Westport, Connecticut. So when it was time to write the book, I was pretty primed, and I spent 6 years doing it, going into some pretty intense primary source research. And if you read the book, not to pitch it, but you'll see, I believe that's the case. And when we interviewed a lot of Fitzgerald scholars, and we were able to interview all of them, we were able to interview um, Charles Scribner III, who is the grandson of the man who published Hemingway, Fitzgerald, and Thomas Wolfe. Bobby Lanahan, the only grandchild of the Fitzgeralds that actually really engages publicly with the press and interviews. And many leading Fitzgerald scholars. And one of them, and I believe he's joined us, is Walter Robitschek, a colleague, excellent professor at Pace University. And when we interviewed him about the role of Westport in Fitzgerald's works, he said it was a noble cause, but to get Westport in the top 25 locations that influenced Fitzgerald was going to be an impossible task. And he further went on to say that of all the locations that the Fitzgerald stayed, Westport has been skipped. So, needless to say, that made me want to, really dig into it. And it was a pleasure. I did it part-time as I wound down. I'm now retired, and then I was able to do it full-time. And what I'm going to do now, and I'll try to make this, fairly brief, but I do want to give you a flavor. I'm going to try to give you about 8 sections of the book. Here's the book, all right? And again, the second edition has come out. I titled the book Boats Against the Current because that's just about the last line of The Great Gatsby. That photo you see is probably the most reproduced of the Fitzgeralds. That's Scott and Zelda in front of the Westport house, where they honeymooned for 5 months in the summer of 1920. By the way, the influenza epidemic was just winding down, so it's interesting that almost completely to the day, a century later, there was a pandemic. This one, not to make light, obviously, and I hope everybody's doing okay and their loved ones with the coronavirus, but much deadlier. And it killed more people than died in World War I. And what this virus did that was particularly pernicious was it killed the young, which I think is unusual. So that was the backdrop. What's interesting is there's been something going on in the internet a lot where it's a purported letter of Scott writing about the influenza pandemic. He never did that. It's a clever parody. So if you see it, Scott never really wrote about influenza. So it was interesting. Scott Fitzgerald once famously said that all my characters are F. Scott Fitzgerald. So that was a great kind of lead in for me because I realized by studying his life, I would, understand his characters. And certainly that came to pass. And back to Walter Robitschek's comment about getting it in the top 25, and he was totally right at the time, was a noble cause, but a doomed one. What I discovered was that they wrote about Westport the most of anywhere that they lived. I'll give you a kind of a flavor of that. Obviously, The Beautiful and Damned, The Great Gatsby, several short stories by Scott, Zelda's only novel, Save Me the Waltz, and Zelda's only play, Scandalabra, featured Westport, as well as many letters where they were back and forth writing to one another, and they're poignant to read because, as many of you might know about Zelda, she, by the age of 29, began to be, they think, bipolar, and she was institutionalized off and on until she died in a fire in the late 40s. So I'd like you to read just a few segments. I'm going to do about 8, and I'll try to make them short. But I think Scott gives us a hint as to how his biography influenced his literature by this. He writes in 100 False Starts, Twice Told Tales. He wrote this in the 30s. Mostly, we authors must repeat ourselves. That's the truth. We have 2 or 3 great and moving experiences in our lives. Experiences so great and moving that it doesn't seem at the time that anyone else has been so caught up and pounded and dazzled and astonished and beaten and broken and rescued and illuminated and rewarded and humbled just in that way before. Then we learn our trade more or less well, and we tell our 2 or 3 stories, each time in a new disguise, maybe 10 times, maybe 100, as long as people will listen. When I face the facts that all my stories are going to have a certain family resemblance, I'm taking a step to avoiding false starts. Whether it's something that happened 20 years ago or only yesterday, I must start out with an emotion, one that's close to me and that I can understand. So right there, Scott's honeymoon, his marriage to Zelda, is absolutely one of the 2 or 3 most moving experiences in their lives. And he wrote about it repeatedly, and so did she, in different guises and different forms. And in a poignant letter that Scott wrote to Zelda in 1934 when she was in an institution, one of the several she was in, he wrote, "The good things in the first years will stay with me forever." So, neat, right? And just want to talk a little bit about right now what Westport is or was like at the time. It was an artist colony and one of the most important in the United States. So let me just read a little bit more. Westport, as I learned at an early age, was not your typical suburban town with a couple of local heroes that went to great fame. It was instead a who's who of American writers and artists, including the likes of Sinclair Lewis, who was in his Westport home when he learned he got a phone call that he'd won the Nobel Prize for Literature. J.D. Salinger finished The Catcher in the Rye in Westport, and the iconic jacket art was done by his neighbor, E. Michael Mitchell. There were so many stories, all of them true, and all of them revealing a close proximity to literary and artistic giants. By the summer of the Fitzgerald's arrival in 1920, Gerard Van Loon, son of the famous historian and Westport resident Hendrik Wilhelm Van Loon, wrote of Westport, and this is one of my favorite quotes because, you know, who doesn't love the 20s, right? And I think this captures it. So speaking of Westport, Van Loon wrote, "As a rural Greenwich village, Westport came into its own with the Model T Ford. Artists, musicians, and writers could afford a summer cottage. A farmhouse could be bought for less than it costs to maintain a New York apartment. And the artistic ex-urbanites formed an ingrown group whose parties were as famous as their divorces were frequent." We're talking 1920. One of my favorite quotes from Van Loon: "There was more adultery per square acre of bed in Westport than any other place east of the Rockies. There was hardly a Westport husband who didn't sob his marriage wasn't a mistake. Drinking during Prohibition was seen as de rigueur. College boy pranks and practical jokes enlivened the Westport scene. A touch of bohemia manifesting itself in Westport attire." And I think my favorite quote that sums up the entire 1920s was by the Westport neighbor of the Fitzgeralds in 1920, Guy Pendabois, who famously quipped that work was an effort made between parties. Nice code to live by, I think, right? And that the Prohibition period, the summers of Westport, exceeded the riotiousness of New York. So the more things change, the more they stay the same. And he's forgotten today, but Van Wyck Brooks was the leading literary giant, really, critic of the time period there. And he wrote that Westport, the road between Westport and Lower Manhattan became an axis on which turned the American literary movement that touched, in one way or another, every aspect of creative life in the United States. So, you know, I'm a homer for the town of Westport. I still live here after growing up. And so we like to always perhaps exaggerate the importance of our towns. But in this case, I came to believe and saw that it was really true. Um, Scott and Zelda get married in April, and within about a month, they move to Westport. And I want to read some more here. What happened was they started to get kicked out of hotels. They got kicked out of two of them. In one of them, the revolving door had just been invented. And Scott and Zelda at one of the hotels decided to spin in it for half an hour. You can imagine how that went. And so they were kicked out of the Biltmore. They were kicked out of the Commodore. They get into an old used Marmon and they drive to Westport, Connecticut. Scott later wrote that it was the happiest year of his life since he was 18. He had just published his first novel, This Side of Paradise. He was making $18,000 in 1920, that honeymoon summer, when the average income was $2,000. And in May of 1920, the Westport Herald had reported that, quote, F. Scott Fitzgerald, a writer, has leased the Wakeman Cottage near Campo Beach. And as a teen, I read the following letter, which really describes why they moved here. It's the definitive reason why they moved here. He wrote to Ruth Sturdivant, who was a friend of theirs, a confidant and friend during his Princeton years. He wrote, in acute agony and despair, we last forcibly left the Commodore, bought a car, threw our bags in the back seat, and set out. We discovered the alarming fact that on our first day on the road from the people we had lunch with, that there was no swimming in Lake Champlain, which they were originally going to, because it's too cold. That was the shock of our lives, Ruth, because if Zelda can't swim, she's miserable. So we bore east, arrived here at 9 o'clock this morning, and found the slickest little cottage on the Sound. We signed the lease at noon. There's a beach here and loads of seclusion and just about everything that we're looking for. We had just about given up hope, and now we're in the most jovial mood imaginable. So Scott was a desperate alcoholic, hospitalized 5 times where he had to dry out, died of a heart attack, but obviously complicated by it. Zelda, within 10 years, again, had been institutionalized. So what they did, Scott was in an alcoholic daze and spiral that really affected his writing. But what he could remember were those golden years, and so could Zelda. That's when everything was good. And I think that that's very important because they could draw on that material. First, they could remember it, and they enjoyed going back to, I mean, one's honeymoon is the apogee of a marriage, right? I mean, especially if you get divorced, then things must have been pretty good during the honeymoon. So I really like that. And that also started to make me think more and more and more that they would use their biography of their time in Westport more and more and more. All right. What Barbara had written about, besides Westport's geography, Barbara Pope Solomon, again, the 1996 New Yorker article, Westport Wildlife, for those of you that are joining us, she found what she believed to be the template of the Great Gatsby. I agreed with her. I did further research. That's in the book and it's in our documentary. I also found a couple of more Westporters that I discussed more in the second edition that were very, very probable candidates for the template for Gatsby. The millionaires that were living around them today, billionaires, were numerous. It was really rather remarkable for the 1920s. So I went on the trail of Frederick E. Lewis, and talk about a mystery man. The only thing I found on the internet 6 years ago when I began to research him was that he had been referred to in Barbara's article, and that he was under investigation for bank stocks in 1907. So I thought that was interesting. But his grandfather was a guy named Moses Taylor. In one study called The 40 Richest Americans of All Time, his grandfather had an adjusted wealth of $48 billion today. So he was born of wealth and he came from wealth. And I'm going to have to cut this short because we're running out of time. Lewis's father left him $300 million on his 21st birthday. And what was a real joy was to go in and take a look at the fact that this guy was much more than just a mystery billionaire today. Over time, by the time he got it, he was an adventurer, he was an explorer, he was a horseman, he was an inventor, he was a yachtsman and race car driver. He had one of the biggest yachts in the world, and more than one. And so F.E. Lewis is a big focus of the book. Want to talk a little bit about Prohibition in Westport because it was fun. The Westport Herald of 1920 talks about 60 stills operating in town. There were 4 policemen, and they could care less about enforcing prohibition. So it was, going against prohibition was like a hobby in Westport at the time. And so I go into an underworld figure, a guy named by the name of Bald Jack Rose, who controlled the liquor in Westport. And most probably, he's the template for Meyer Wolfsheim in The Great Gatsby. And I'll because we do have to run, I am just going to read. Well, I gotta do this one. It's too fun. So one of the great stories in Westport lore is when Zelda was reputed to call the fire department. It was their weekend parties would start Friday and go to Wednesday. Okay. And when the firemen arrived and asked where the fire was, she pointed to her breast, saying, "The fire is here." And they made 2 headlines with that fire. False alarm sent in from Campo District. Firemen made quick run to the Minuteman, but found no fire. Operator says alarm came from the Fitzgeralds. They deny it. Remember, Zelda's 19 at this point. We always think of these, previous people as much older than what. He was 24. She was 19. And I'll just finish from reading, and thank you for hanging with me. And hopefully you're not half asleep. At the end of their lives, it was clear that that was the best time of their marriage. And as I write, I think the brain has a natural opiate that makes you remember the good times more than the bad. I don't know. I just think it's a survival mechanism that we're wired for that. And he wrote, 20 years ago to Zelda, she's institutionalized. She's in really bad shape. 20 years ago, This Side of Paradise was a bestseller, and we were settled in Westport. And it was the happiest time of our time. And this was probably Sam Waterston, who played Nick Carraway in the 74 Gatsby, which I think is the best, was part of our documentary. And I think he summed it up best when he wrote, he's a highly literate man. Sam Waterston said, "You were making arguments in your own favor here that sounds like this was the moment of the most intense love that the two experienced. And it seems that that's the core of it, isn't it? The hopeful, idealistic dream of real, enduring love, with the strong implication that you don't get that in this world. If that's what they went away from here feeling, then maybe this place did animate that novel." And by the way, doesn't that sound like Gatsby? And in The Beautiful and Damned, right at the end, Fitzgerald writes, "On the day they left the gray house, which had seen the flower of their love." Okay, I'm going to take some questions. Again, there's not a lot of time, and I'm sorry for prattling on. Not that my students ever said I did. Okay, but wasn't Gatsby? Hi, Pamela Norman. No, it wasn't. Okay, but what anniversary just passed was their marriage, just a few days ago, April 3rd, a century ago. So the thing. Thanks, Doug, for loving the book. Sarah Krasny, one of my colleagues at the Westport Museum, asked, "Do you think that Zelda's mental health issues could have influenced their decision to come to Westport, which had 2 sanitariums, which could possibly have offered them treatment?" Well, it's interesting because the Westport Museum did this really great. There were 2 sanitariums in Westport that are famous. Fitzgerald writes about one of them in a short story, how he knew two people that were institutionalized there. No, she was, acting pretty flamboyantly, but at that time, I don't think that's the reason that they were here. But it showed up in their fiction, and Sarah, I think it was kind of prophetic. Um, and Doug, I love where you write, Zelda and Scott were on fire from ages 18 on. Well, and what's ironic is that, and I went into this, there was a book called The Salamander by Owen Johnson, came out in about 1910. And it's about a girl it's a flapper, flaunts conventions. And Zelda read it, and she copied it in her life. If you read that book and read about the salamander, you see that it is a description of Zelda. So Zelda read this book, and there's this great phrase, until you plagiarize it, it's not your own. She plagiarized her life on this book. But what was prophetic, and I thought heartbreaking, was the salamander in Greek mythology is able to escape through fire unscathed. And she died in a fire. She was locked in the top floor of a sanitarium. It went on fire. She was incinerated. The only thing they found, I don't mean to be grim, but if you go visit their grave in Rockville, Maryland, there's not much of Zelda there, because again, she was incinerated. So she died in a fire. She liked to light fires. She was known for doing that. She liked to call fire departments. She used to do that in Montgomery, Alabama, too, as they did in Westport. And tragically, she would die in a fire. For those, just to put it in perspective, Scott was 44 when he died, and she was 48. So live young, die fast, right? So thank you for joining us. We're going to wind down. Again, this is the centennial of their time in Westport. If you're a Fitzgerald fan, and it's not because I wrote the book, but if you're a Fitzgerald fan and are interested to see the majority core of what influenced their collective works, and again, for those of you that weren't here maybe at the beginning, Westport shows up in The Beautiful and Damned. It shows up again in The Great Gatsby. It shows up in Zelda's only novel, Save Me the Waltz, and it shows up in her only play, Scandalabra. By the way, both of those are pretty tough reads. She would write in a very vibrant style, but kind of a hallucinatory one too. So, and again, shows up in several of Scott's short stories, and it shows up in a lot of letters between the two of them. One of the things I did, one of the last lines in the book, was I wrote about how Scott and Zelda, we should admire them because they had courage to live life to the fullest when it was good, and they showed us how to do it, and they also showed us how to navigate life when it was at its worst, because it was not a happy ending for both of them. But anyway, one last thing I like to tell people is it's fun to read Gatsby in the summer. It's 50,000 words, almost you can read it in a summer day. And what's also fun about Gatsby is to read it like once every decade, because as you know, books change over time. So thank you for joining us. Sarah, I see your questions about what all stories were based on them. At least 3, but we're running out of time. But they're in the book. Okay, so good luck, everybody, in these extraordinary times. I think we're facing it with courage and pluck, and certainly from my Facebook posts and Instagram, ton of humor, and we'll get through it. So thank you. Let's go, Scott and Zelda. 100 years later, we say good night to you from Westport, Connecticut.